Good evening. I'm Dan McCauley. I'm the Executive Director of the Brookings Area Habitat for Humanity. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our honored and esteemed speaker tonight.
You.
He said I could say anything I wanted that made me feel good. So, in my side gig, I teach at the university, so I hope you don't mind that the introduction takes 15 minutes. This is Chuck Marohn. Chuck, not Charles, Chuck. Chuck is a civil engineer and urban planner. He has those degrees from a university other than South Dakota State. And given what's going on in town tonight, I really appreciate all of you making time for this and not being on campus with the basketball team. Chuck and his team at Strong Towns do weekly email articles and podcasts. Strong Towns, he's the author of Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution, and that's what he's going to talk to us about tonight. The city of Brookings uses Strong Towns ideas to make better development decisions in the designs of streets, neighborhoods, and the community for future generations to build a stronger Brookings. We welcome Chuck and look forward to his presentation. Thanks for being here, Keith.
Hey, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Yes, thank you. That's very kind. I realize I stole a chair. There's a bunch of Catholics here. Everybody's sitting in the back. It's all right. I'm Catholic. We can all sit in the back. Except for the one family with 9 kids. They always sit right in the front. Thank you. It's nice to be here. I just want to clear the air before we start. I recognize that you're all making somewhat of a sacrifice to be here tonight, especially if you're a basketball fan. So just so we're all on the same page, if you have to get up and walk out at, say, 5 to 7 or whatever time you feel you need to, you won't offend me. I know in some cultures that's considered rude and impolite to get up in the middle of something and walk out. I will not consider it rude and impolite. So feel free to do that if you need to. It's very nice to be here today. I'm from Brainerd, Minnesota. I don't know if any of you know where Brainerd is. It is, like 4 some hours from here. I was in Sioux Falls this morning. So I drove down last night in the storm and spent the day there. It was about 5 hours. I've not been here before, and it's very nice to be here. You have a beautiful city. Everyone I've met has been very, very smiley and nice and kind and friendly. So I'm kind of excited to share some ideas with you tonight. I run a nonprofit named Strong Towns. Nonprofit named, like it just came to me with a name. I called it Strong Towns. I started writing a blog back in 2008. If you remember back to 2008, we were having gas prices at $4 a gallon and housing markets crashing and banks failing and big bailouts and crazy presidential elections and all this stuff. And in the midst of that insanity, I sat down and said, either I am crazy or the world is crazy. One of these two statements is true. I am going to write down what I am seeing and what I'm experiencing in the communities I'm working in and share this with my friends and see what they think of these ideas. After a year of writing 3 days a week, some friends of mine came to me and said, you need to start a nonprofit. I told them, no, I got too much going on. And they said, well, we're going to start a nonprofit and you're going to be part of it. And so they did. They filled out the paperwork. They got it started. A year later, we had a 501c3. And then a few months later, a foundation in Minnesota gave me 3 years of startup money. Actually gave me $50,000 a year for 3 years to figure out what Strong Towns should be. Today, Strong Towns is an international movement of people who are working to make their cities financially strong and resilient. We have one of our strongest town winners here from a couple years ago. We do 2-3 articles every day. We do 3 different podcast streams. We do a lot of videos. We are trying to grow a movement of people who are thinking differently about cities and asking for something different. So tonight I'm going to give you the presentation that I put together for the first book, Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution. The second book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, came out last September. And we're working on the third one right now about housing. But this one is about cities and how they grow and how they evolve and change. And my thing is not working all of a sudden now. I'm not sure why. We'll give it a try and then we'll see. Nope. All right. Well, it wants to be picky with me. I'm adaptable. You guys are adaptable? We'll do it this way. All right. We're going to start off talking about my transition's a little off. I haven't done this presentation for like a year, and I really love it. So the problem I run into is that I'm going to embellish because I like it so much, but I'm trying to get done in a reasonable amount of time so you can all go watch basketball. So if you're okay with me embellishing a little bit, I want to start this whole conversation talking about complex adaptive systems, which is a really geeky way to talk about something that I think we all intuitively understand. A rainforest is a complex adaptive system. When we look at a rainforest, we recognize that a rainforest is made up of many different flora and fauna, right? They all act independently of each other. They all respond to stresses and opportunities in the environment, independent of one another. Their actions affect everything else. There's feedback loops involved. When we look at a rainforest, we recognize that a rainforest has an order, but the order is not imposed. The order actually emerges from all these complex interactions. It's easy for us, I think, to grasp the idea that the rainforest is complex and adaptive, fractal in nature. It's a little bit more of a challenge for us to look at human habitat in this same way. Yet, if you want to plug that in down there, maybe I don't want to make you crawl around, but... Oh, I'll try yours. Thank you. Oh, look at that. All right. It's a little bit tricky for us to imagine human habitat, human spaces, as being complex and adaptive. But if we go back in the history of city building, we recognize that cities of the past were collections of individuals working kind of with their own agency, in a community with each other, but with a lot less like rigidity and restriction and planning than we have today. There would sometimes be frameworks set up or sometimes be, systems set up, but a lot of the action that we saw, again, emerged from the complex interactions of many different people working independently of each other. These are complex adaptive systems. A complex system differs from a system that is merely complicated in terms of how it adapts to stress. A Rube Goldberg machine is really complicated, right? In fact, the fact that it's complicated is kind of the novelty of it. There's all these strings and buzzers and blocks and stuff that happen. But we look at a Rube Goldberg machine and we understand that if you move one of these blocks or cut one of these strings, what happens to this machine? It breaks, right? It stops working. If you think of your automobile engine was designed and built by really, really smart people. But we recognize that if you stress an automobile engine beyond its capacity, beyond what it's designed to do, it doesn't evolve and become a toaster or a wash machine. It just breaks. It just stops working. This is the fundamental difference between systems that are complex and systems that are merely complicated. Complex systems have within them a certain amount of adaptability. They can change and evolve over time. If you take a rainforest and you give it too much rain or too much sun over any one cycle, you might see the flora and fauna change a little bit. It might evolve and adapt, but it's not going to fail. It's not going to be the end of the rainforest. But if you take a cornfield and you give it too much rain or too much sun, you're not going to see it evolve and become soybeans or become sugar beets. It will just fail, right? It will just stop being corn. This is the same kind of shift we see when we talk about human habitat, the places that we live in. When we build cities as complex adaptive systems, what we see is that when they're subject to stress, when they're subject to opportunity, they evolve and adapt and change. They're able to respond to that in novel ways. When we build cities as rigid structures, when we build them as machines, kind of in a mechanical way, what we lose is that inner flexibility, that inner adaptability, that capacity to evolve and shift and change. They become very rigid, and in a word, become fragile. This is my hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. Back in 1871, we celebrated our 150th year anniversary last year. Yay, Brainerd. COVID bad, bad timing, right? There were all these celebrations planned that never happened, but that happened to everybody a little bit. This is the very beginning of Brainerd. And the interesting thing to note here, right off the bat, is that if we could go back and find a picture of Brookings in its original form, I'm almost certain it would look exactly like this. Like it'd probably be indistinguishable from this. Every city that was ever created prior to this kind of new experiment we've been on post-World War II began just like this. Some pop-up shacks, some hopes and some dreams about the future. We built thousands of these across North America, and for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that are really hard to predict or project or even to understand fully after the fact, a lot of these places would fail. What happens when a city like this fails? Does, the stock market plummet? Do we have massive unemployment? Does, we need to have Wall Street bailouts from Washington? No, of course not. What happens here is that a few people lose a little bit of money, they salvage what they can, and they move on to the next place. We built thousands of places just like this, and for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, they would grow in a very simple yet complex way. They would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. Think of a culture growing in a petri dish, how it grows, a complex system. And what you would see here is that as more and more people would move to this place, the place itself would start to grow in value. The land would actually become worth more. And as the land was becoming worth more, what was happening to these kind of junky pop-up structures? They were starting to fall apart. And so that combination of rising land values and declining structure values would create this natural redevelopment pressure. And after a generation, you would get the street right here. This is the exact same street from roughly the same place 33 years later. And over time, my city would continue to grow, as Brookings did, as Sioux Falls did, as Waterton, as all these places have done. It would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, becoming incrementally more intense. The land values would continue to rise. The buildings would go into decline and create these redevelopment opportunities. And in another generation plus, these 2- and 3-story wood buildings would become buildings of brick and granite. We can go around this city here and see successions of this happening. We can go back and look at buildings that had gone through these multiple generations of modest little pop-up building, something a little bit more substantial, something more substantial yet. If you travel east in this country, the further east you go, the more you will see this having taken place. I've got some amazing photos of Times Square going through hundreds of years of this succession, right? There's an ultimate place where you get to Paris and you get to London and you get to Manhattan following this trajectory. The idea is that this complex adaptive thing can continue to thicken up, continue to grow, continue to become more substantial. Just so we're all on the same page here, I want you to imagine in your brain what the development pattern would look like at this period of time. So, 1940s, a block or two off of this. What would it look like? What would the development intensity be? It'd be something like this, right? And if you went a block or two off of that, what was the development intensity going to be? It's going to be something like this, right? This is that successive pattern, that growth out, that growth up, that growth in intensity, kind of a continually strengthening center with an opportunity for everyone to kind of plug in at some point. If you're very poor, you plug in out here. If you're kind of a little bit more affluent, you can plug in here. If you're very affluent, you can build your bank in the middle of town. And there's a place kind of for everybody to start. And as this system continues to grow like this in this incremental way, everybody can kind of see rising affluence from it. Here is what this street looks like now today. And if you want to grasp in a nutshell or in a snapshot why cities across North America struggle so mightily in ways that they didn't in the past, struggle today, understand that in this street right here, yeah, I got a red thing. there's $500,000 of public infrastructure investment. You add up the road, the sidewalk, the storm sewer, the water, the street lights, you got $500,000 in the ground. Where is the wealth that we're going to tap into as a community to sustain that investment? That wealth used to be there, right? It was there in a big way. It's no longer there. And so my community struggles to do basic things like fix the roads, fix the sidewalks, keep the streetlights on, keep firefighters employed, keep the police department fully staffed. This is a shared experience of cities across North America. I want us to understand why we made this shift from cities as complex adaptive system to cities as something merely complicated. Cities as something that we would kind of lightly plan and then watch emerge and grow like that culture in a petri dish, to something that we went out and said, here's where the sewer will go, here's where the water will go, here's where all these things will go. How did we make this shift and why? My grandfather was a Marine in World War II. He passed away about a decade ago. Just to give you some context, he was the first group that went in after the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. So he grew up during the Great Depression. I remember talking to him about the Great Depression, and he, would make statements like, without FDR, we would have been dead. This sounded like a little bit of hyperbole to me, but this is a guy who spent a great deal of the Depression living in their neighbor's barn. His mother passed away when he was little. He wound up moving in with the neighbors. They let him sleep in the barn. They would feed him, and then he would work the farm. So this is in Minnesota. Barns are not particularly warm in Minnesota in the winter, but that's where he stayed. He told me that he felt lucky to have that. My takeaway from those conversations and my takeaway from other readings about the Great Depression was that the Great Depression was a very disorienting period of time for Americans. The depths of despair, the depths of tragedy, the depths of need and want are something that today we have a difficult time grappling with. One of the most disorienting things about the Great Depression is that no one understood why it happened. Even today, our economists debate, here's what caused the Great Depression, and you'll read it and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's really smart. And then there'll be another economist who'll say, no, that's completely wrong. Here's what caused the Great Depression. And you'll read that and you'll say, well, that's really smart too. Like, that makes a lot of sense. No one understood what caused it. Even more importantly, nobody knew how to get out of it. No one knew how to end the Depression when we were in it. The whole entire New Deal project was this attempt to try many, many different things and see what would work. Let's try this program. Let's try that program. Let's try this initiative, that initiative. What is the thing that got us out of the Great Depression? What are we told in junior high ended the Great Depression? World War II, right? As if World War is like some great, happy event. Like, yay, we got a world war and now GDP is growing again. If you're a bean counter in Washington, D.C., and know nothing of human suffering, maybe World War II seems like a great thing. But for the rest of us, it was, ration gasoline, ration sugar, ration butter. Take all your young people and send them overseas to kill and to die. Take all the other people and put them into industries, creating ships and boats and planes and munitions to kill people with. And we look at this and say, well, this got us out of the Depression, but not to some place we wanted to be. As the war was winding down, during the First World War, it wasn't clear till the last 6 months who was going to win. But during World War II, it was very clear for like the last 2.5 years that the Allies were going to win. It was just a matter of time and like how this thing would play out. The economists around FDR started to freak out. This is a quote from Paul Samuelson, one of the kind of most influential American economists of the last 100 years, but someone who was a key advisor to FDR. He said, were the war to end suddenly, which everybody wanted to have happen, right? There would be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation any economy has ever faced. What he was saying was that if we end this war and we bring all these troops home and we shut down all these industries, we're just going right back into the depths of the Great Depression. There's nothing different about our economy today than 10 years ago. And there's nothing that's going to keep us from just sliding right back to that once we end all this war spending. Is that what happened? No. All of us have the gift of hindsight, right? We can all see what actually happened. What actually happened was something radically different, right? We came up with a new version of America. We did something radically different. And I want to, going back to that complex adaptive discussion we began at the beginning, explain to you what we did. When we ended World War II, we were the only major industrial power not decimated by war. We had all of our industrial capacity that we had ramped up to 11, right? Just sitting there idling, ready to do something. We had the world's reserve currency. We were the economy of the world. We had all the world's gold. The gold that they had not given to us to sell them stuff, they had actually transferred here for us to hold because it was safer than keeping it over there. We had all the world's gold. We had more oil coming out of the ground than Saudi Arabia. I think, incredible for us to think of today, given the kind of polarized partisan nature of our public discourse. But we had a culture united around common enemies. If you remember back, those of you that remember September 11th, remember the day after September 11th and the week after, how close you felt to everyone around you, how, at the Capitol, you had Nancy Pelosi standing next to, I can't remember who the Republican is at the time, arms locked, singing God Bless America. I mean, this is bizarre today that you'd ever think of such a thing, but that's who we were. They were that times 100, right? They had just gone through this existential threat together. And they took all of this unity, all of this capacity, all of this resource that they had, and we put it into a new version of America. We are going to keep ourselves out of the Great Depression by turning our cities into growth machines. And if we can make them machines of growth, we can create prosperity for everybody. Here's the amazing thing. It actually worked. At least for a period of time, it actually worked, right? We were able to, in those years after the World War, grow our economy at rates that we've never seen before and create this huge middle class, all of these jobs, all these opportunities. In fact, I'm going to say something now. I want you to, if you know that you tend to react in a partisan way to things, I want you to just suppress that for the next 30 seconds. Because what I'm going to say is not a partisan insight, but you might be tempted to hear it that way. When I look back at the 2016 presidential election, and a little bit the 2020, but really the 2016 presidential election, what I heard at the time and what I, heard vocalized from our two major candidates was their vision of the greatest time of their life and how they were going to create that for us again today. That vision was a vision of the 1950s and the 1960s. There were two 70-year-old candidates looking back at their life saying, this is when the greatest period of my life was. Let's make this happen again. And whether that was a vision of Aussie inherent family and blue-collar jobs, right? That was one vision. Or whether it was a vision of a federal government that was very expansive and could do big things like expand Medicare and expand Social Security and do all that stuff. They were both talking about the same period of time, this amazing couple decades after World War II, where everything seemed possible. I'm going to walk you through how city as growth machine actually looks like. And I'm going to use a map from Fresno, California. And I'm using a map from Fresno because two reasons. One, it's never good to show you a place that you know intimately. It's always good to show you a place that rhymes with a place you know intimately. And number two, I've got great maps of Fresno. So walk through this. I think you will recognize the pattern because it's a pattern universal to North America. So here we are in the late 1800s. This is the boundaries of Fresno, California. That's its boundaries. I want you to watch how it changes over time. So we're in that complex adaptive phase where cities grow incrementally. You can see the increments of out combined with the, at the same time, there's going to be an increment of up, an increment of kind of thickening up in place. Here we are at the midst of the Great Depression, and then here we are at the end of World War II. Now, we get rid of this complex adaptive system. We end this incremental pattern of growth, and we switch over to a kinetic growth machine where we're growing cities very, very quickly in order to create jobs and create wealth and create the middle class and create the American dream. And here's what happens: 1958, 1970, 1983, 1995, 2010. Our cities became engines of growth, machines of growth. A machine where you put oil in and gas in and out comes energy, or you put infrastructure spending and capital money and housing subsidies in, and you get massive growth very, very quickly. Is it wildly successful in terms of creating growth? I'll point out here, and this is kind of a little bit of foreshadowing, my little town of Brainerd, Minnesota, at the end of World War II was 13,500 people. Today, Brainerd, Minnesota is 13,500 people. It's 10 times the area. What we discovered, kind of belatedly, and it's been a very painful discovery, is that growth is different than productivity. Growth is different than wealth creation. Growth is different than prosperity. This is some data that I was able to obtain as part of a project I was invited to work on in Lafayette, Louisiana. In Lafayette, Louisiana, at the end of World War II, they had a population of a little over 33,000. Today, it's a little over 120,000, 3.5 times amount of growth. It's a tremendous amount of growth in that period of time. Yet if we look at Lafayette, Louisiana, what we see is that at the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person to provide water for the people of Lafayette to drink. Today, it takes 10 times that amount. We can look and say at the end of World War II, it took 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people to provide fire protection for the people of Lafayette. Today, it takes 21 times that amount. So our population grew by 3.5 times, but the amount of inputs it took, the amount of long-term liability we now have, grew by 10 times and 20 times. Okay, you can say, well, what does that matter, Chuck? It's not a big deal. We're a wealthier country now. We're a more affluent country now. None of us would want to go back to 1945. We live in bigger houses. We have more stuff. We got bigger cars. We got big garages. We're living a much more affluent way than they were back then. And I would ask you to question that. I would ask you to actually look and say, is that true? Because while we see in Lafayette, they've grown their population, yes. They've grown their liabilities even more, yes. But when we look at things like family income, it's hardly moved at all. In today's dollars, it's only up 1.6 times. When we look at household wealth in places like Lafayette, Louisiana, what we see is that household wealth has stagnated for decades. We actually have more families with negative net worths today than we had 30 years ago. There was a report out a couple of weeks ago that said 60% of American families are living paycheck to paycheck. Literally don't have enough money if some major expense comes up to make do. This is not the byproduct of an economy that is creating prosperity. Creating growth, yes. But do we all grasp the difference between growth and wealth creation? That's what I want to talk about right now. Early on in Strong Towns, one of the things that I did and that my colleagues helped with was we started to look at developments and their payback. Cities are really complicated. And when you start to analyze a city in a holistic way, you run into all kinds of nuance that make that analysis really, really difficult. And what I kind of postulated early on was that if I could look at the constituent parts and look at the parts of it that were, in theory, like the most profitable or the parts that should be the most productive for the community and understand what was going on there, I could infer in other parts that were less productive what was going on. And so this is a dead-end cul-de-sac. It's the simplest residential development. The road has not been upsized for future traffic. The sewer and water are not deeper for future development. It's just a dead-end road. The only reason this road exists is because there's homes there. If there were no homes, there would be no road. If there were no road, there would be no homes. That's it. This road was built, and when it was built, the city paid half the cost, and the property owners paid the other half. We sat down and figured out how much taxes the city was collecting from the people on this road, and said, how long will it take the city to recoup the amount of money they spent to build it? The answer is 37 years. The road's not going to last 37 years, but it will take the city that long to break even. At that point, someone needs to go out and fix the road. Where is that money going to come from? Not from these property owners here, right? Where is that money going to come from? It's really unknown. Here's another development. This one is a little bit more intense. If you look closely, you'll see it's a closed loop system. There's a dead-end cul-de-sac up here. When this one was built, the developer went in and built all the roads, all the infrastructure, all the sewer and water, the drainage, everything, and then, in a sense, gifted it to the city. So the city had no upfront costs. Of course, who paid those costs? The developer didn't pay those costs. The developer financed those costs. Ultimately, that was rolled over into sale price of the homes, and people have been paying that on their mortgages for years. At the same time, they've been paying sewer and water fees. At the same time, they've been paying taxes to the city under the guise of, when this stuff falls apart and needs to be fixed, you'll have the money, the city, to do that. The road completely fell apart. The city went out and did it. It was a $354,000 project. We looked at the taxes the city collects from the people who live within this development. Again, no through traffic, no commercial traffic. This is just a closed loop system for the people who live here. And we asked the question, how long is it going to take the city to recoup the amount of money they just spent fixing that road? The answer is 79 years. We then said, okay, what if the city wanted to, between now and the time the roadway fell apart, collect enough money from these property owners to actually fix their street? What would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes, with annual increases of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years, with all that money going just to maintain the roadway. Note here, the sewer, the water, the storm sewer, these are all vastly more expensive undertakings. This is just the road surface. Now, sometimes people say, okay, Chuck, we get it, we understand. We know that the city's going to lose money on residential. We're going to make it up on commercial. I don't understand this business approach. I don't know any corporation that loses money on 90% of what it does and tries to make it up on the last 10%. I don't know why a municipal corporation would think that that was a good business strategy. But nonetheless, we've kind of convinced ourselves in this kinetic growth machine kind of phase of our existence that if we just generate enough commercial growth, everything would be okay. This is a business park. It's one of those build it and they will come kind of investments that cities do to try to generate growth and jobs and economic development. This was built a decade and a half later. Every lot was developed. Every lot was built out. And the city felt this was such a successful project, they wanted to build the same exact thing on property they owned right next door. So they were just going to mirror this, actually take literally the same thing and just build a new one right here, same size and everything. We said, great. It's a perfect case study. If we could build the same thing, the same cost, and get the same return, how would that work out for us? The cost, we inflation adjusted up to present time. We could look and see how much tax base there was in this business park. Now, a couple of things about the existing park. 4 of the lots belong to a church. Churches don't pay any taxes, okay? 2 of the lots belong to the school district. It was their bus maintenance building. School district doesn't pay any taxes. 1 of the lots was a county maintenance building. 1 of the lots was a city maintenance building. So again, no revenue coming from those. We modeled it, taking that into account, and we never could even pay the interest on the new bond, right? So we had to assume as part of our development that no non-tax paying buildings. In the existing park, every building that was theoretically a taxpayer had been given a tax subsidy in order to encourage them to move into the park. 5 years, 8 years, one was 20 years. Tax abatements, right? Their taxes didn't actually pay for any of this stuff. For the sake of our analysis, we assumed, because if we didn't, it didn't work, that everybody built out their lot within 1 year of the new development being built, all the new infrastructure being put in, and that every penny of revenue was not abated or subsidized, but went to the city and was used to pay down this debt. If that were the case, it would still take almost 3 decades, 29 years, for the city to pay off the initial investment. That's 29 years where everybody else's taxes would need to go up to plow the snow off the streets, mow the ditches, sweep the streets, provide police protection, fire protection, and everything else. And that is in the most wildly optimistic development scenario. This is a bad project. Let me walk you through what's happening. And I'm going to apologize here because I know that there are people who do not like charts. I have an engineering license and I'm required to show you at least 2 charts in every presentation. I will walk you through these so they're not painful. Okay, there's 3 charts here. They'll be very easy. This one is a chart of cash flow. I want you to imagine that you're a city council, you're the decision maker in a city, and a developer comes to you and says, I have a piece of property I would like to build upon. As a developer, I am willing to, at my expense, build all of the residential homes, build all the commercial buildings. I'm not asking for any subsidies or handouts. I'll meet every requirement of your code and ordinance. I'm not asking for any exceptions to any rules. I will, at my expense, put in all the pipes and the pumps and the valves and the meters and the roads and the streets and the sidewalk and the curb. I'll do all that. The only thing I'm asking as a developer is that when I get done making this investment in your community, that you, the city, the public, you agree to take on the long-term responsibility to provide service and maintenance to this new development. What would we say to that proposition? We would jump up and down and say, amazing. You're not asking for any subsidies, no handouts. You'll follow all of our rules. No negotiation. You're just going to gift all this to us. We would say, this is astounding, right? This is a better deal than most cities ever get. But what if, we're very smart people, we're very prudent people, we've heard of this strong town stuff, we want to do the right thing. So when this money comes in from this new development, when this new tax revenue comes in, now is this windfall for us created by this developer and all these new people who live here or these new businesses that have opened here. We take that money and we set the portion aside that would normally get spent fixing and repairing and taking care of all this stuff. We set that money aside. And every year when the money from this new development comes in, we add to what we've set aside and we allow it to accumulate so that when we get out a generation from now, and those people then have to go out and fix that road and fix that pipe and maintain that sidewalk, they've got a pot of money to do it. Here's what this looks like from a cash flow standpoint. In year 1, everything is brand new, hasn't cost you anything. The money comes in and you take that portion and you set it aside. In year 2, more money comes in and you add to what you had in year 1. In year 3, you add a little bit more and a little bit more in year 4 and on and on and on. And you can see a 5-year-old road isn't costing you anything. A 10-year-old sidewalk isn't costing you anything. A 15-year-old pipe isn't really costing you anything. And so year after year after year, the money comes flowing in and there's nothing really going out. You're gaining a lot of cash in this account. And when you get a couple decades out, you got a big old pot of money sitting there, right? Until the day you have to go out and make good on this promise that was made a generation ago. And then what you find is that the cumulative amount of money you brought in is insufficient. And from a cash flow standpoint, you run far into the negative. Now, cities aren't one development, right? Cities are a series of development, a collection of neighborhoods. So let's say that our developer, a couple of years after that first development goes in, comes back to us and says, that worked really well for you, it worked really well for me. I would like to do a similar development. In fact, every other year from this point forward, a developer walks in the door with a proposal to do a similar size development. In other words, the ideal scenario for any community, nice, steady, continuous growth. And we take that money and we set it aside and we save it for the day when we have to make good on all these promises. Here's what that looks like for the first 25 years. In year 1, you've got your first development. It pays in the entire time here shown. Year 3, you add another one. Year 5, year 7, and on and on and on. And you can see, not only do you not really have any expenses out of this, everything's brand new, but you're having growth upon growth upon growth. Your cash starts to accelerate upwards, feeling very, very rich. And when you get to year 25, the year you have to make good on that very first promise you made back in year 1, yes, you got to spend a little bit of money, but it's not a big deal, right? You've had all this growth. The growth creates what we call the illusion of wealth. Because as we all intuitively understand, if you make money on every transaction, if you lose money on every transaction, you don't make it up in volume. If over time you lose money on every project that you do, the further you go out in time, the more downward pressure there is on your budget. We can grow really, really, really quickly by taking on enormous long-term liabilities. We can trade future promises for the sugar high of cash today. But all of us live in 2022. We all live with accumulated debts and commitments of prior generations. And when we look at city halls across the country, when we look at states around the country, when we look at the federal government, what we see is that we are overwhelmed with what? Unpayable promises from the past, right? Debt. I was just reading the other day how the city of Indianapolis, and this is endemic, like this is everybody, right? So I'm not going to pick on Indianapolis. This is you, this is my town, this is everybody. The city of Indianapolis needs to increase their city budget, not their capital investment budget or their road budget, their city budget by 83% forever, just to keep up with road maintenance, so it doesn't get worse. 83% just for roads, right? Sewer, water, storm sewer, police, fire, parks, public buildings, all the, it is enormous. We have been tricked by this illusion of wealth, right? Go back to the original story we talked about the end of World War II and how we created this growth machine. Do you see why Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump would say this is the most successful 2 decades of America's existence? Do you see why people who look at China today say, wow, what an economic powerhouse? Yeah, what an economic powerhouse. They've been building for the last 30 years. It's all brand new. Give them another 30 years and see what happens. This is not hard to understand. What's hard about it is what to do now, right? What's difficult about it is what do we do now? Because in the US system, what we see is that the federal government can very easily pass a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill like they did last November and use that as a way to juice the economy, to juice GDP, to get us to grow more, to get our cities to grow. If we, in exchange, take on more and more long-term liability. That's what's broken. That's what's stuck, because we can't take on any more. I want to show you how this development pattern has affected our ability to meet these promises. These are 2 identical lots in my hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. If you look at them, you'll see they're the same size, the same area. They have the same amount of public infrastructure. The only thing about them that is different is the style of development. That block on the left is built in the traditional style. If you remember the pop-up shacks I showed you from the 1871, this in the 1920s was the far edge of town. These 3 blocks were. So what you had on these 3 blocks was basically the pop-up shack equivalent of the 1920s. The people who built these would have assumed, looking back at all of human history, that they would build these little shacks out on the edge of town, Over time, the city would grow. When the city would grow, they would become closer to the center than they were now because the city would continue to grow out. And because of that, their buildings would get second and third stories. Their land would become more valuable. Things would become more ornate. Of course, that's not what happened, right? We built these in the 1920s. Then you had the Great Depression. Then you had World War II. Then you had the kinetic growth machine kicking in. And we just skipped right over top of these properties and started building hyper out. These places have stagnated for a century. The block on the right used to look just like the block on the left. We got it torn down and we replaced it with a Taco John's. By the way, I travel around the country and I get to this and everyone who looks at me quizzically, because it's a very few states that have Taco John's. I know we do here, right? You guys have Taco John's. So you know what I'm talking about. And they ask me to interpret, what is Taco John's? What is this? And I want to tell you what I tell them because I think you will find this handy. I tell them it is Norwegian Mexican food. And they get it right away. They're like, oh, okay, that's what it is. That's what it is, isn't it? That's a fair description. It's Norwegian Mexican food. Everybody was thrilled about this, right? If you go down the list of things that we said were important, this checks every box. We got rid of blight, check. We got something shiny and new, check. It meets the sign ordinance. It meets the floor area ratios. It's got a sprinkler system. It got rid of the on-street parking. It's got ADA compliant bathrooms. When we did this, we had bike walk advocates in town who wanted a sidewalk. So they built a sidewalk right here. The sidewalk ends right here, but they got this little stretch right here. We had some environmental people who wanted native plants in a stormwater area. They put those in right here, back by the dumpsters, native plants. Everybody got what they wanted. Here's what nobody bothered to consider or look at. That old blighted rundown block has a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new block, it's the same size area. It has the same amount of public infrastructure investment in it. It costs us the same to provide ongoing service and maintenance to, but that block is only worth $600,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at, on the left, the traditional pattern of development, that complex adaptive system. You're looking at it in its infant state after a century of decline and neglect and atrophy. And it still financially outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we're building brand new today. And everybody in this room knows what's going to happen to that Taco John's 20 years from now, right? It will be a used car lot at some point. There'll be a new Taco John's up the road. After a few years after that, we'll be trying to get some type of tax subsidy to get it torn down and rebuilt. We've all experienced this and seen this in our communities. I want to show you that this is not an anomaly. It's a really good case study, and it's really compelling because I think it challenges what we have culturally come to understand success looks like. Success looks like Taco John's, but if we're actually interested in how we pay for things and what the financial productivity of our communities is and our capacity to do good things, it looks a lot more like that old and blighted block. I want you to show you that that is not an anomaly. There's a good friend of mine named Joe Minicozy who has done modeling of cities. His firm, Urban 3, has done modeling in cities across North America and now to some extent around the world. I'm going to show you right now a series of cities, starting with this one, which is Buffalo, New York. I want you to think of a farmer going out and spreading seed on a field. The parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, that's the part that we say is the most productive, right? That's the most productive part of the field. That's where we get the most bushels per acre. Well, where's the most productive part of a city? Where do we get the most wealth per acre? Where do we get the most value per acre? And in a city like Buffalo, New York, which, by the way, has suffered a century of decline and neglect. If you go to Buffalo today, I really like it. It's a nice place full of good people, but the eye test, it just looks rough, right? They have lost population every single year since the end of World War II. Steady, steady decline. If we step back and say, where is the wealth in Buffalo? Can you point to their traditional downtown? Can you point to that pre-Great Depression complex adaptive system? Not only is it a massive repository of wealth, it absolutely dwarfs everything we have built subsequent. This is a pattern we see repeated in cities over and over again. And it doesn't matter if it's a big city or a small city. It doesn't matter if it's a northern city or a southern city, a coastal city or an inland city. It doesn't matter. Every place where we see the pre-Great Depression pattern of development, we see enormous amounts of financial productivity, places that build wealth for the community, places that create wealth, even when they're in states of decline. And everywhere we see the post-war development pattern, that kinetic growth machine, that idea that what the city provides value for is to grow, 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 we see diminishing rates of investment return. And we see cities becoming poorer and more stretched out. This is Little Crosby, Minnesota. It's a little town next to mine. For a number of years, I was a city engineer for Crosby. Then I was a city planner for Crosby. I know the city very well. I remember going there and having them say, Chuck, we've got great stuff happening out here. We've got great stuff happening out here, but these neighborhoods in here are really horrible. We've got to get some of this stuff torn down and rebuilt so that it's nice. And then you look at where their wealth is. Their wealth is in the poor neighborhoods, the neighborhoods where all their poor people live. This is Lafayette, Louisiana. I mentioned Lafayette earlier because I was part of a really big study. This map is different than the other ones. The other ones showed you productivity, wealth per acre, where's our wealthiest places. This is a map that shows us profit and loss. So this is a map that took 10 times the amount of effort to create than the last ones. We went to Lafayette and we looked at every expense that the city had. We looked at every revenue source the city had. We mapped them all up. And at the end, we mashed it together and created this map. So every place where you see a blue property, what you are looking at is a property that pays more in taxes and fees to the city on an annual basis than they require in ongoing service and maintenance. The higher the line goes, the more profit, in a sense, the community makes off of those parcels. Every place where you see red is the opposite. These are places that require more in ongoing service and maintenance costs from the community than they contribute in taxes and fees. You see the pattern here? Again, the pre-Great Depression parts of the city are financially supporting and subsidizing everything else. You've got the center core here. You've got this set of neighborhoods here. Let me show you what these look like so that you've got a picture in your mind. That upper right-hand corner is the core downtown of Lafayette, Louisiana. I like Lafayette, again. They're very nice people. You can go there and listen to some great Zydeco music and get a really cheap taco. It's a cool college town. But this downtown is not spectacular. That neighborhood in the bottom left looks bad, looks rough. That's because it is rough. It is bad. It has experienced a lot of neglect. Our model assumed and assumes that the city is actually going to go out and fix the street, maintain the lights, maintain the ditches, do the stuff they're supposed to do. The fact that they're not doing that here only makes the productivity of those places, the profit of those places, even greater. On the right here, you're seeing places in blue, places that are financially successful, not because they visually pass some eye test, but because their layout and pattern and design is financially really productive. That stuff in red is the stuff we all know, right? It's the big box stores, it's the strip malls, it's the drive-through franchise restaurants, it's the windy, curvy cul-de-sac streets with the suburban homes on it. Just to give you a sense of what's going on in Lafayette today, there's two subsidies that are taking place. The poor neighborhoods are subsidizing the affluent neighborhoods. And future generations are subsidizing the current generation. In Lafayette today, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. In order for the city to maintain all the stuff they've built, make good on all the promises they've made, fix every pipe, fix every street, provide all the police and fire protection, maintain the parks, do all this stuff, Median taxes would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. 1 out of every $5 the median family makes would need to get sent back to the city just to maintain the stuff they've already built. That's not going to happen. There's zero chance that that will happen. And so what Lafayette has experienced in the 6 years since we went and did this study is something that we see in cities all over North America. An annual decision on what street to maintain and what street to let fall apart. What pipe to take care of and what pipe to hope doesn't break next year. What thing to follow through on and what thing to give up on. What neighborhood to keep and what neighborhood to walk away from. This is very much the story of Detroit, right? Story of one of like America's greatest cities. If you go to Detroit of 100 years ago, you would have seen a city of such opulence that it would have completely amazed you. You can go there today, and if you ever get a chance, I would recommend it. It's a fascinating place. Go to the Detroit Opera House. You will see a place so regal that you could drop it into like Milan or Prague, and it would be right at home. It's amazing amounts of wealth. What happened to Detroit is that as Detroit was becoming the auto city in the early 1900s, they were the first city to experiment with this new style of development. They were the first city to run their highways right through the middle of their neighborhoods, the first city to create commuter suburbs where people would drive in and drive out. They were the first city to tear down buildings at scale to build parking lots. And when we got to the Great Depression, and cities around the country were literally going into bankruptcy, were literally filing bankruptcy, we had hundreds of them, when places were experiencing huge amounts of dislocation and unemployment, there was one place and a region connected to it that comparatively did really well. That, of course, was Detroit. And so by the end of World War II, it was a very easy sell to the mayors and the Chamber of Commerce presidents and the local congressmen exactly what we needed to do in this country if we wanted to be successful. We all needed to copy the development pattern pioneered by our most successful city, that being Detroit. That's exactly what we did. Detroit's not some like weird, crazy place. They're not different than you and me. They're just early. They're just like a generation ahead of the rest of us. It is 7 o'clock, or if that clock is 1 minute early, it's 6:59. I've just finished the depressing part of the conversation, the history and the insight. We're going to talk for the rest of the time now about what we do differently, like how do we do things differently. This would be a good time if you do need to go to a basketball game, you can go now. But I would welcome you all to stay because this is where the presentation, I hope, gets a little more hopeful. In my first book, at the end of chapter 3, I talk about Detroit, and my mom read my book before it came out. And I asked her to, and just to give me some feedback. And she said, she called me at the end of chapter 3 and said, "This is a really depressing book." I said, "Hang with it, Mom, it gets better." And she will tell you that it did get better. But we're going to go on to that now and start talking about what we do different. I get a lot of people ask me, why? Explain this. Explain, this, because it goes against what we think, right? We think, and the common narrative, even in Lafayette, Louisiana, where we've done this study and they have the data, the common narrative for a long time is it's these neighborhoods out here that's subsidizing the middle. It's the wealthy neighborhoods that are subsidizing the poor neighborhoods. It's the mall that's subsidizing the downtown. It's the big box stores and the McDonald's that's subsidizing the little family restaurants instead of the other way around. And it's hard to get your mind wrapped around the fact that that's not the case. In nowhere in this country is that the case. I'd like to point out there's a number of factors. People ask me to break it down. Give me the 5 things. And I'm like, it is different in every place. It is different in every place. And the answer is that it's really complex. I'm going to give you 2 quick ones, okay, to get your mind around. And they're 2 quick ones that apply to Lafayette, but might not apply to you. In fact, let me give you 3 quick ones. Lafayette, Louisiana is built in a swamp, right? If you've ever been down there, don't go in August. I went for a week in August. It was like the sixth circle of hell. It was really, really hot and humid and nasty. In Lafayette, they built in a swamp. Guess where the high ground is? The high ground is right here and right here. And guess what is amazing about the high ground? Why would the first people who built in Lafayette build on the high ground? Because God drains it for you. It's a lot cheaper, right? This stuff out here, where it's huge red, that's like all swamp that has been reclaimed. They got pumps running all the time. That's ridiculously expensive. We found houses in a neighborhood here where, in this blue area over here, this really cheap, bad neighborhood, we found houses in that neighborhood where the sewage runs from the house in a pipe into the street, into a pipe, and then runs down to a lift station and is pumped to the sewage treatment plant. We found houses in this neighborhood up here where the sewage runs from the house in a pipe, runs into a larger pipe in the street, runs down to a lift station, and then is pumped a succession of 23 different times before it reaches the same treatment facility. Both individuals, both homes pay the same sewer charge, but one of them costs like 200 times more to provide service to than the other. Do you see how this is starting to... I want to show you one other one, and I think this one is very easy to understand. When you're building a city, and go back to the pre-depression city, the complex adaptive city, and you build along a street, you're building a building, and you look out and you recognize that in order to maintain this street, you and the people around you are going to have to do that. Whether that means you all grab rakes and shovels and go out and maintain the street, or you all collectively pay taxes or whatever to someone who does. If your capacity along that street is not sufficient to maintain that street, the city's not going to maintain, like no one's going to fix it for you. How do you build your house in such a place? Well, what you would do is you would build your house skinny and deep. Because by building it skinny and deep, what do? You share the cost, the burden of maintaining that with many, many, many more people. Okay, now let's go post-World War II. City as a growth machine. We don't care about maintaining stuff. We don't care about taking care of stuff. We don't care about the long-term costs. All we care about is getting the next development in, right? Grow, 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 build, 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 build. That's what the growth machine is. So what happens to our house now? It turns into that ranch house we all know. It's the same exact house, it's just different, right? It's just laid out different. Remember back when I showed you at the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person to provide water service? And today it takes 10 times that, 50 feet of pipe per person? It's the same damn house, right? It's the same house, it's just a different configuration, changing the underlying cost structure. So how do we start to deal with this? I think it's really important to come to grips with the idea that we can't go back to 1930. We can't have that city back. We have to start with what we have. We have to be real. We have to start with where we are. And so what we have to do is we have to inject some complexity and some adaptiveness back into our very stagnant, very fragile, very rigid structure. And so the first thing we do is we have to allow everywhere at all times the next increment of development intensity by right. That's a mouthful of planning jargon. Let me break it down for you. In every neighborhood, you should be able to look around and say, what is here? And then whatever the next level of intensity, if you have a neighborhood of single family homes, the next level of intensity is a duplex or an accessory apartment, a granny flat. If your ordinance doesn't allow that really easily, no real regulatory friction. I mean, I show up at 9 a.m. with a completed application and I walk out by noon with a permit. That's what by right means. So I don't have to go beg special permission. I don't have to go special hearings. I don't have to talk to my neighbors. I'm allowed to do it. Every neighborhood in the city should be allowed through zoning, through whatever regulations you have, to adapt to that next increment of intensity with zero regulatory friction, but no more. We have a saying at Strong Towns, no neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood can be exempt from change. One of the things that we've done in this trade-off, in this mechanical development pattern we have now, is we've said everybody's neighborhood can be frozen under glass. Never change, never evolve, never adapt. And that's the promise we make to all of you. But your neighborhood, I'll pick on you, your neighborhood's really poor and disenfranchised, and there's some developers that got an eye on it. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna allow your neighborhood to radically transform. We'll put 5-story apartment buildings in your neighborhood. And what that does is it reinforces the notion that all of you have, that I don't want my neighborhood to go decline and become like his. And so we fight to never have any change at all. This is not a healthy way to build a city. Every neighborhood needs to be able to adapt, to evolve, and to change. But no neighborhood should become unrecognizable to the people who are there. No neighborhood should undergo such radical rates of change that it becomes unwelcoming or uninviting to the people who are there today. As part of this, we need to systematically and very intentionally lower the bar of entry. If you remember that early system of the pop-up shacks, what I tried to impart there is that there was a place for everybody to enter the game. There was a place in the system for everybody, no matter what level of affluence they have, to be part of building the city and to benefit from that overall growth and success. Today, what we have done through many, I think, well-meaning or well-intentioned reasons, raise the bar of entry to full participation in society. Let me give you an example. You want to have a house? You want to be part of the American dream? You must have qualify for a 30-year mortgage. In order to qualify for a 30-year mortgage, you need what? A job, an income history, probably a profession, right? You need some stability. You have to have a lot of things that are out of reach for many people. And in fact, because it's out of reach, it actually creates this kind of cascading effect where fewer and fewer people start to qualify for it. We have the highest amount of housing subsidy in the world, in the US. I just said something that I should have kind of previewed a little bit. We're the most ridiculously backward socialist country in the world. We subsidize housing more than anybody else. You could go to Sweden and you're like, well, they're a bunch of socialists. They don't subsidize housing anywhere near what we do. We have insane levels of housing subsidy, yet we have some of the lowest rates of home ownership. Okay? Let that stew around in your brain. I'm a free market person. I love markets. I think markets are going to help us solve a lot of these problems. We do not have a housing market. We need to lower the bar of entry and invite more people in to participate in building our cities. Let me give you a couple examples of what this looks like. This is something that in my city we call a tiny house. My ancestors would have called this a house. For some reason, we have put the adjective tiny on the front of it and said, if you want to build something as offensive as this, you have to go through this really long, drawn-out process. You have to meet all the requirements of a house. Then you have to meet subpart A through M of the tiny house ordinance. You have to go ask permission from your neighbors. You have to genuflect in front of the planning board. You have to go through all this stuff just to build what anyone throughout all of human history would have recognized as a starter home. How many of you would like to live in a 600 square foot home? How many of you have lived in a 600 square foot home? Right. That's the point. We all start in something like this. This is the quintessential place that people start. And when we say you can't build this, or this is illegal, or it doesn't fit in, or here's the long drawn out process we do, we sideline a whole bunch of people who would otherwise participate in building our community. There's an analog to this in commercial space. This is from Muskegon, Michigan. In Muskegon, they had lost a lot of population They had significant amounts of population decline. What they did in Muskegon is they were struggling to get businesses to fill in their downtown. And in fact, the only businesses they could get to move in there were chains that all wanted subsidy. They went and talked to people who were kind of home business or entrepreneurs, and they said, what's going on here? And they would say, well, I can't move into one of those places. If I move in, I've got to update the bathrooms to be ADA compliant. I've got to put in sprinkler systems. I got to, make hundreds of thousands of dollars of upgrades to this building, and I don't even know if my business will work. I don't think a bank's going to give me a loan for that. It's too risky. It's too high of a bar to entry to start out. And so what Muskegon did is they bought a bunch of storage sheds. They painted them up funky colors. They took a gap they had in their streetscape and they filled them in to kind of close that gap. And they rent them out dirt cheap to startup entrepreneurs. $75 a month, no long-term commitment. Come in, open up, try out your business, see if it works. And what they've said is, come in and fail. Fail quickly and fail where the cost of failure is really cheap. Because if the cost of failure is really cheap, what does that give you the opportunity to do? To try again, and to try again, and to try again. And what they have found in Muskegon is not only are these places always full, there's always a waiting list to get in, there's a huge ton of energy that this has created, but their downtown, if you go there today, you'll see, are full of businesses. And many of those businesses got their start here, where the stakes were really low, where they could figure it out and build up the confidence and the knowledge of how to run a business, so then they could take out that big loan or they could make that big investment and they could fix up that building in the downtown that was struggling so much. When we lower the bar of entry and we invite more and more people in to participate, amazing things happen in our communities. The final strategy I want to give you tonight has to deal with the structure of city government and how we internally make investments. We're very used to the government being the entity that will go out and get the federal grant to do the streetscape, or get the state funding to go do the project over here, the sewer and water, or get the developer to come in and use Wall Street money to build a new hotel or a new subdivision. We're very used to the city operating this way. And if you go into City Hall, not just here, but like any city in the country, what you will find is that City Hall is very sensitive vertically. We have, as part of this growth machine, asked our cities to become implementation arms of state and federal policy. We've asked them to set themselves up to receive these vertical capital flows coming from Washington, D.C., coming from the state capitol, and coming from Wall Street. And so when you go into City Hall, you'll see they're very set up and they're very sensitive to where that money is coming from and how it is to be spent. If we want our cities to make great investments that we spend $1, we get way more than $1 back, we build wealth within the community. If we want our cities to do that, we have to ask them to reorient themselves from a vertical alignment sensitive to the capital flows to a horizontal alignment sensitive to the struggles of people within the community. We have to ask them to focus with an almost obsessive way on where people are having a difficult time using the city now as it has been built. Remember, we're trying to get back to that complex adaptive system, that feedback loop. At Strong Towns, we've created a 4-step process for cities to make the lowest risk, highest returning public investments that we can make. I'm going to go through this process for you. I'm going to preview it by saying, what I'm going to show you right now is ridiculously easy. Any city can do this, regardless of how wealthy or how poor they are. The only thing stopping us is our own cultural apprehension. Step number 1, go out and humbly observe where people are struggling. Where are people having a difficult time right now using the city as it has been built? I'm going to emphasize humility here because it's really hard. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble. It is really hard to have humility when your job is to deliver services. You tend to believe that you know what the problems are. You tend to believe that you know what the solution should be. And so you tend to define things in terms of what you know. By humility, I mean try to get all that out of your brain, go out, walk a mile with the people in your community, and understand where they are having a hard time using the city as it currently exists. Step number 2 then, ask yourself a question. What is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? Not what is the thing that will fix this forevermore, not what is the thing that we can get the state grant to do, not what is the thing that we've got in our capital improvements plan that we've been dying to do that will be done in 3 years. What is the thing we can do right now with paint and straw bales and cones and duct tape that will make this struggle a little bit easier? Step number 3 then, do that thing. Do that thing right now. Don't send it to a committee. Don't hire a consultant. Don't study it for 6 months. It's just a tiny little thing. Go out and do it. And then step number 4, repeat the process over and over and over again. Jane Jacobs, the great writer and urbanist, called cities at their best a co-creation, something we build together. And if you go back to the pre-Great Depression city, you will see that cities were a co-creation. The city had a role, property owners and people had a role, and those roles were much more cooperative. Today, how do cities function? We pay our taxes, and we expect the delivery of services. At City Hall, they receive the taxes, and they expect you to stay out of their way while they deliver the services, right? It's a non-cooperative relationship. If we want to build great cities, if we want to make great investments, if we want our cities to grow stronger and more productive, we have to actually obsessively focus on where people struggle and make the small incremental changes to address that, and then learn from how people shift and change their behavior to create that kind of feedback loop where we're always iteratively making things better. If we do this way, we will find that we can make really great investments that are very low risk and very high returning. And all of those investments will make people's lives better. We can go on this path here. And I don't mean to pick on poor Lawton, Oklahoma, although I showed this last week when I was in Oklahoma City, and a woman from Lawton got really mad at me. It's hit a little close to home. This is a federally subsidized project. Someone in Lawton city government came to the conclusion that, because they went to a city that had great streetlights and a lot of stuff going on, and they said, well, if we can have great streetlights and a nice streetscape, we'll have lots of stuff going on too. That's not how it works. But they were able to go out and get a grant, $20 million, to redo the streetscape through town. And they did. And they brought me out there and showed it to me, and it made me really sad. Because what they didn't do is they didn't start with where people were struggling. They started with where they wanted to be, not where their people were. We can continue to follow this route, and it's easy to do. Our city halls are set up to do it. Our state and federal programs are set up to do it. The Wall Street funding machine is set up to do it. But we will be continually frustrated by the results. Or we can take a more humble approach, and we can do something like they did in Memphis, Tennessee, where they went out and they took a couple blocks that had been neglected and dilapidated. Some residents cleaned them up, went out and worked with the shop owners to get the buildings swept out. They invited business owners to come in for a weekend and open up and just show people in the community what could happen if there was actually life in these places. They went out and they painted their own crosswalks, their own bike lanes. They put up a little mural. They tried to make the place just a little bit nicer. They brought me out there and showed me this after they were done. It wasn't fantastic. This wasn't, the greatest street ever, but it was a little bit better than what it had been before. And that little bit of better signaled to people that someone cared. Someone was going to do something. And what you see in this neighborhood, the city's gone out and documented what happened after this project. After this project, they had almost 30 buildings that were renovated in the vicinity of this street. They had rents go up. They had a bunch of new businesses open, and they had massive appreciation in property values. Total public investment, just peanuts, a couple $1,000s. This happened like 8 years ago. The city's gone out now because it was so successful and taken these temporary things that they did and done what? The next iteration, right? So the bike lane's in permanently now. They put in raised concrete and they made it permanent. The mural is now done really nicely. The crosswalks are now painted with a kind of permanent paint instead of the little hardware store, slap-on job. And if you go to this block, these 2 blocks in Memphis, and you look over, what you see is that this little temporary stuff, they've got 2 blocks on each side of it now. They're actually doing this project again, kind of spreading the love into the neighborhood, experimenting as they go. If we can humble ourselves to do this, not only can we find that we can make really cost-effective investments that are very cheap and very high returning, but they will also be investments that cannot help but improve people's lives. And that is the essence of a Strong Towns approach. We can do amazing, amazing things with what we have today. Make our cities better, make them more prosperous, give our additional capacity, and improve people's lives, all by humbling ourselves to do the small, urgent thing in front of us. Thank you very much for being here. I'm really extra honored that you all are missing parts of the basketball game to be here. It means a lot to me, so thank you very much. And I am here the night tonight. I'm going to get up and meet with your council members at a retreat tomorrow. I'm a little tired and going to go to bed, but I'm happy to take whatever time you want here tonight to answer questions or chat about things. If you're interested in knowing more about Strong Towns, we do publish 3 articles a day. We have a website where we're sharing podcasts and videos and all kinds of stuff. Just so you know, at the bottom of the page, you'll see a Creative Commons license. That license says anything that we write, anything that we publish, anything that we produce is for you to use. And I always clarify it by telling people, if I've written something that you find particularly smart or intelligent or thought-provoking or worth sharing, feel free to copy and paste it and put your name on it and pretend you wrote it. That's totally fine with me. We are trying to share these ideas as broadly as we can. So does anybody have a question or a comment or something they would like to talk about? Please.
I work with Habitat for Humanity. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate your comments on lowering the bar of entry.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I really appreciate the comments on doing the next thing in your neighborhood to increase.
Yeah. Yeah.
We got a million.
Did you just say density?
Yeah.
I didn't.
I know you did. I was trying to search for the word that you said.
Yeah. Yeah. You're good though.
We got $1 million gift last year, which is a huge amount of money, and I can't believe the needle on affordable housing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I appreciate those comments.
Thank you. Just for you, I'm gonna steer you in a direction. I said at the beginning, we're writing the 3rd book in the series right now, which is about housing. I feel like the most exciting case study coming out of that book is what's going on in Oswego, New York, OSWEGO. The Oswego Historic Renaissance Association is a collection of private individuals who created a little neighborhood nonprofit, and they do grants for facade improvements. But the method that they use requires people to apply as a block, and it really is about overcoming what they call a bank run on confidence. They want people to believe in their neighborhood. And so what they do is they ask people to come together on a block, talk about what they want to do, and then they will use a little bit of seed money to help make that happen. And what they have seen in terms of affordable housing, in terms of neighborhood investment, in terms of just upward advancement of places that are really struggling has been astounding. And they've done it with pennies. So I look at the stuff that Habitat does, and I see a lot of Habitat organizations struggling with a narrow mission of building housing, and I see others prospering with this broader mission of building neighborhoods and communities and being a catalyst for that. So I would just point you to Oswego because they're really inspiring to me. Thank you. Anybody else? Please go ahead, and then.
Just a moment.
Oh.
The people listening online.
Oh, the people
can't
listening
hear
can't hear the
mic,
questions?
so-
I will try to repeat them. Does that work?
That works.
Okay. Sorry, people online. I forgot about you. My apologies. Go ahead, please.
I have a question about
Yes.
getting the next step for the vast majority of towns that are residential, single family.
Yeah.
Large lots, and don't want to allow the mother-in-law apartment or
Right.
units on there.
Right.
Are there any towns that have figured out how to make that happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question is, we've got a number of neighborhoods that are resistant to that next step. They don't want that next increment. Are there any places that have figured out how to do that? Let me answer it by saying no, but I'm trying to answer your question narrowly. I don't know of any city that has neighborhoods that said, we absolutely oppose this, where they force them to do it, right? Now, there's some nuance to that. California passed statewide an ordinance that says there's no such thing as a single family only lot anymore. Any lot that is in existence today has to allow, I think it's a triplex in California. It might be, I don't know. In Minneapolis, they said the same things. There were certainly people who opposed that. So they've overcome that. But I think the idea of going out and saying, especially in the context of a city this size or the city of your size, that we're going to force a neighborhood to do this, it becomes really difficult and problematic. In the first book, in Strong as a Bottom-Up Revolution, I actually address this a little bit. And I point out that cities oftentimes will allocate scarce resources through a rubric of where is the place that is the most broken. So we have enough road funding to do 2 miles of road repair this year. Where's our worst 2 miles of road? Some cities, really messed up cities, will say, we have 2 miles of road repair this year. What road does the mayor live on? And that's the road that gets repaired. You're familiar with this, right? Like this is how, because you always have more needs than you have money, right? What I have suggested is that we actually shift it around and say, all right, our priority investment neighborhoods. So our community is pooling their money in taxes to maintain roadways. We don't have enough money to maintain all of them. We can maintain some of them. Our priority investment neighborhoods will be the ones where there is a consensus to experience this upward acceleration. Because I can put $1 into that neighborhood and get $1.20, $1.40 back. I'll put $1 into this stagnant neighborhood that is refusing to have any change, and I'm going to lose 50 cents. And so as a community, as a steward of the public dollar, if I have to make a decision on which of, Sophie's choice, like which neighborhood's going to get funded, I'm going to fund the one that has the upside potential. Does that make sense? That I feel like is like the universal politically astute way we could do it. You had a question.
You mentioned the word density, but I think the word you used was intensity, which is something different and broader maybe, and I wonder.
Yeah. So the question is about density versus like other words. Intensity, I think I used productivity, thickening up. I had a bunch of different ways, but I never use the word density. And I'm gonna tell you why I don't use density. I have a master's degree in urban and regional planning. I'm a planner, and I worked for a number of years doing planning work. And let me tell you, if you ask a planner to deliver density, they will be ecstatic, they will be happy, they will love to do that, and they will come up with all kinds of schemes to create density, and you will hate all of them. There are so many places that provide density, but don't provide good urban form, delightful architecture, places people actually like and enjoy and want to be. Density is like the coarsest metric. And the way I describe density as a metric is it is a likely outcome of doing things well, but it's not like a goal in and of itself. So having a healthy looking body, muscular and tan and healthy looking fit is a good outcome. But I wouldn't tell you like that's the goal, right? Or that's the process. The process you should use is to eat well, exercise, get out. You could also just take steroids and drugs and do plastic surgery. But to me, that doesn't seem like the route that most people would want to go. I think planners have this obsession with density that manifests in the tools they have, which is zoning and rules and regulations, in really unhealthy and unproductive ways. So when you think about a neighborhood as being a place that is habitat for humans, that needs to be able to evolve and adapt and change over time, you will ultimately experience greater density, but that should never be the thing you're trying to accomplish. It'll be like the byproduct of it. The thing you're trying to accomplish is a neighborhood that is responsive to the needs of people within it. Does that make sense? And I feel like maybe I'm being a little bit slippery with my words, but I've written a couple articles on why I never use the word density, and it really comes down to the fact that planners will deliver horrible density if you let them. Please, you had a question?
Yeah, so in Brookings, as a college town, around the university area, the couple of blocks that surround it, there has been a kind of trend of taking old, especially historic houses, and splitting them up into small apartments, and then renting them out to college students. And there has been, because of that, a decline in the care of these apartments, as well as a decline in the living.
Yeah.
Like the standard of life for college students.
Yeah.
Go into that. Do you have any
Yeah. So the question becomes, in a college town, and I'm going to embellish your question a little bit. College towns have so much energy and life and vitality. I mean, there's so much upside to a college town in terms of you're bringing people in. They're people at a very exciting part of their life. They create a lot of energy in a place. But when we slum them, when we put them all together in one place, which you've seen happen around the university, where some of the old houses have been converted into duplex and multifamily units, and then we cram college students into them, and then we don't care for them as much. We kind of ride them down this slope of decline. That hurts the students, it hurts the neighborhood, it hurts everybody. This doesn't seem like a good strategy. What do we do different? Is that a fair summation of your question?
Yeah.
Okay. This is all very true. And you would never give up the vitality of having a university to avoid this problem, right? This is like one of those problems that comes with universities. But the question becomes, like, how do you deal with it? How do you address it? I hope I haven't given anyone the impression that I'm a no regulation person, or I really think we have the wrong regulations. We have a toolkit for kinetic growth. We don't have a toolkit for maturing and thickening up our neighborhoods. As I think about a neighborhood like that, the toolkit that I want has an emphasis on keeping existing residents or people in those neighborhoods so that you don't get a concentration of students in one place. What you really want is that thickening up. You want these homes to be converted into multifamily units. That's a great thing to have happen over time. What you don't want is you don't want students concentrated in 4 square blocks, because what that does is it allows people to treat those blocks in economically negative ways. So I was going to say they become slums. They become slumming because college students will live in junky places and pay high rents, and it's a really good strategy to do that. Ideally, what you want is like every third house to be a college student house. Because what will happen then is that the other 2 in between will actually have people that will keep rising in value. It will benefit from the energy next door. Can hire them to mow my yard or take care of my plants or come over and, read to my grandma. I don't know. There's all kinds of things that having multi-generation people in one neighborhood does, but you don't get that concentration, right? And as things go up, what will happen is that house with the multiple students in it won't be able to experience that in what we call this riding the slope of decline. There's a strategy for housing that says if you can get into a slum house and then charge rent and put as little bit into it as you can ride it out for a decade or 2 or 3 and make good money along the whole way, and then just sell it for scrap at the end. What you actually want is the neighborhood to be appreciating in value. And I'm going to put this in real economic terms. You want their taxes to be going up every year. And you want to be there a benefit for them for investing in that place. Because what will happen at some point is that the third house with the students will actually become too valuable for student housing to a duplex. And so the person who owns that property will have to make a decision. Do we renovate it and convert it back into non-student housing and sell it or rent it out? Do we renovate it and make it a fourplex instead of a duplex and make our money that way? But that rising land value of that place will actually force a decision, a positive decision with the developer, where they're like, it's not economically tenable to keep it the way it is. I've got to do something more with it. And that's actually where you want to get as a community. You want your land values going up so that there's opportunity. The tension that people feel is not tension of how do I hold on to avoid decline, but how do I make the most of this rising value that I have? St. Thomas in Minnesota did this, I think, in Minneapolis, did this, I think, with the best way possible, which is they just said, I think it was you can't have a student housing within 2 houses of another student house. And I think it was like a simple rule like that. Like you can't do this. So if you want to have student housing, you can, but it can't be on the same block, like within 2 houses of another one. And what it did is it just took the demand for student housing that was here and just spread it out over here and made the whole neighborhood awesome. Someone else had, go ahead, please.
City council elections are happening here in this town, and some people, everywhere.
Yeah.
Council members have ideas of just like, cut it all, right? Like, cut all the budget and everything for that, this election season. And so I just kind of want to know, you said you're meeting with city council tomorrow, kind of is your message different? Do you kind of have the same message?
Yeah.
For city council versus public?
Right. So what is the message I'm going to have to city council tomorrow? Is it going to be different than this one? And, what do we do in an election season where we have people who, and you didn't say this, but let me say it my way, very radical views of what local government should be. Maybe it should be run like a business, or we should slash it to the bone, or maybe we should quadruple taxes and have, basic guaranteed income in our city. There's all kinds of, there's a vast range of reactions to these stresses. Tomorrow morning, I am meeting with the city council here. My message will be very similar to this. Let me clarify, though, that I don't think that any of these problems or any of the ways we go about dealing with them will work if it's just the city council on board with this. Literally, we have to, as a community, as people, be talking about this. The coffee shop talk, the barber shop talk, the sidelines of the soccer game talk has to shift. It has to shift to recognize all the stuff we talked about tonight and the long-term trade-offs. And we have to, as a community, kind of own this problem. So I will not be talking to them about the things that they must do independent of the community. I'll more be talking to them about here's how you here's how you understand the stress that you're going through, and here's how you communicate it to people because you've got some difficult choices to make. I think that so we're in the process of rewriting our strategic plan, and it's a very exciting time kind of for us because we're shifting a little bit our approach. One of the things that we've recognized in the last 6 years since our last strategic plan came out is to really hone in on the role of local government. We talk about this a little bit in our last strategic plan, but the new one is going to say something really important. It's going to say local government, paraphrase this a little bit, local government is not the bottom rung in a hierarchy of governments. Local government is the highest level of coordination of us within a community. And my presentation to the council will treat them in that way. You have to look at this community as you being the highest level of coordination and advocacy amongst people in the community, but recognizing that there's also other groups within that. Please. You're a little different?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a total believer in engagement, getting people involved and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, my great-grandfather taught me a pretty simple rule. A man with one watch always knows what time it is.
Yep.
A man with two is never sure.
Right.
And we designed our community over the years that we used to have a city commission and totally involved in everything, and we decided we should go with a city council that only is supposed to do policy. And we have 3 individuals who work for the city council, and that's it. All right? The
Yeah.
city manager, the city lawyer, and the city clerk.
Right.
The same thing holds true when we redesigned our school board, all right? That is strictly tied to policy, all right? We currently have a large number of people running for office, as well as some in office, that believe, for example, that on the school board I should hang out with every parent and every teacher to find out what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a administrator who's like, come to me and we can figure out the groups to put together. Same thing holds true with my good friend Paul Ricino, that he has counselors and former counselors who feel that they should meet with every,
Yeah.
individual that works for the city.
Right.
And how do you get the point across that we're as a city very interested in engagement?
Yeah.
But once that engagement occurs, right, and a consensus is put together,
Right.
the person with the watch makes the decision.
Right. So your question is about public engagement and the interface between
How do you
getting,
get
yeah,
comfortable, but also understand the
right.
decision?
How do you make tough decisions? And right. Okay. Let me say a couple things about public engagement. I wrote an article. If you go on Strong Downs and search Google for Strong Downs, cool ringtone. The article is called "Most Public Engagement is Worthless." And then a friend of mine wrote a follow-up piece to that is titled, "Most Public Engagement is Worse Than Worthless." And I think these are both really brilliant insights. Again, going back to this kinetic growth machine that we created, one of the things that we recognize at the end of the 1960s, and it's codified in the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, all these other big environmental laws, is that we were just had delegated all this authority to a handful of people to build highways and bridges and dams and destroy neighborhoods and do urban renewal. And we created a system of public engagement to try to, in a sense, push back on this massive, like czar-like authority we had given these agencies to really wreak havoc on places. And that was looked at as a huge value, as a huge benefit. Because now, before we destroyed your home, we would have a meeting to talk about it. And we would have, a mandated public hearing where we would collect input. It didn't really affect the outcome in a lot of ways, but we created this theater of engagement around that act. If you fast forward another couple of decades then, there started to be a cynicism with the mechanical aspects of like environmental reviews and clean air appropriations and clean water permitting. And advocates and others started to say, no, we want real depth of engagement. And you had this kind of notion arise that you're kind of, I think, pointing to as being false and fake and not helpful, which is I'm available for anyone at any time. Go ahead and give me a call. I'm going to listen to you. And kind of this thing that like what a leader is today is someone who has got their ear to the wind and listening to everybody. And I always want to talk to everyone and I always want to hear what you're going to say. We talked a little bit about running government like a business. That came up, your question, right? And I didn't really follow up on that aspect of it too much. You said cut it to the bone or whatever. And I think it was me who said run it like a business. I want to use a business analogy here to kind of point out what government has done and where I think public engagement breaks down. All of us are familiar with Google, right? If Google is going to release a new version of Gmail, what do? Do they release it all at once to everybody? Of course not. That's not what they do. That would be ridiculous. What do? They find like their 5,000 most ardent Google Gmail users, and they say, hey, guess what? We got a new beta version of our latest thing. We think it's awesome, but we don't really know how well it works yet. Would you be willing to try it out and give us feedback? And so they'll be like, yeah, of course, we would love that. Now, I've been involved in these things. Do you actually ever give them feedback? No, not at all. You never write down feedback. What do? They watch you use their program. They actually say, okay, when you're in the program, they clicked on this and then this and then this, or they did this and that, and they kind of watch what you use, where you get stuck, where you get frustrated, where you refresh your screen, where you back up, where you do this. And they can use that data from thousands of people to kind of figure out this is what people are responding to, and this is where they're stuck and struggling. So then they'll go and they'll tweak that and they'll change that, and then they'll go find 5,000 people more, or maybe they'll make it 10,000, or maybe they'll get 100,000 this time, and they'll test it out and they'll try it out. And then once it's gone through those iterations and they got enough data, they've experienced enough, they actually release it broadly to everybody. By the time you're getting the next version of Gmail, it's already awesome because it's been tried out a bunch of times. Chris Rock is in the news lately, right? For getting slapped alongside the head. There's a really fascinating book called Little Bets, and it starts out talking about Chris Rock and his comedy routine. It says Chris Rock does this HBO special, right? It's now Netflix special, but back when the book was like 15 years old, he does this HBO special. Anyone who thinks that he shows up at the HBO special with a bunch of jokes that he's doing for the first time does not understand anything about the process. What Chris Rock does to create the jokes for the HBO special, which by the way, everyone gets huge laughs. It's an hour long and you laugh at every single joke. No comedian can pull that off unless they've done what he does. What he does is he starts out with a yellow notepad of jokes. And he goes to some hole-in-the-wall comedy club with 10 people in it. And he sits up on stage and he does the jokes. And 2 out of 3 of them bomb, or 4 out of 5 of them bomb. But he circles the ones that don't. He circles the ones that are kind of close. And then he goes back and he repeats the process. And he keeps doing it in this low-level, low-scale thing until he gets the feedback that affirms that I know what I'm doing. And then he takes it to a little bit bigger club. And then he takes it to a little bit bigger club. And then he goes out on the road and does a stand-up comedy thing, and he's tweaking it. And by the end of it, he gets to the point where he can record an HBO special, and he is the brilliant Chris Rock with all these great jokes. Here's the way we should think about this in government. If you ask people what they want, they will tell you stupid stuff. If you ask them what they want, they will tell you really dumb things. If you go solicit them and say, what do you think about this? They will also tell you really dumb things. And if you go back to them a week later and ask them the same question, they are almost certain to tell you something different than they told you that time that you first asked them. Guess why? Because humans are just weird.
Well, in my case, you're singing to the Mormon church.
Right, yeah. Humans are just weird.
In general.
Right. And so how do we...
City council,
Yeah,
why can't we have a lawyer who says, point of order to our counselors?
yeah,
In our charter, this is your responsibility. Why don't we have somebody at the school board?
that I can't answer, right?
When somebody's campaigning, somebody
Yeah.
raise their hand and say, point of order. Because,
Right.
I mean, we get
I hear you.
this scramble of,
Yeah.
like you say. I try to explain to people that somebody saying something 1,000 times is
Right.
not the same.
No.
as 1,000
So,
people saying it
right.
once.
Someone saying something 1,000 times is not the same as 1,000 people saying it once. Totally agree. Let's put this into something actionable then. How do we deal with this problem of people being fickle, not knowing what they want, giving bad advice, bad feedback? I think the thing that we do is we just take small steps, right? This is why large projects and large public improvement things and huge investments are really problematic. Because what winds up happening is that we'll put together a big shiny project we want to do, and then we'll hire the consultant or whoever to do the sales job to marshal it through the process. I don't know if you guys do school bonding things. We just went through one of these 2 years ago. It was a $200-some million set of projects. You know, each one of them had problems with it, but it was like either vote against this big thing or hate children, you know? And you wind up with this like horrible sales job. What we should have done is we should have done 25 different small projects. And they should have been incrementally kind of done. And we should start small and like work our way up. And we should use the feedback. This is when I say that 4-step process. Do a little thing, watch where people struggle, go out and do the next smallest thing. What you're doing is you're product testing. You're saying, like, I think the problem here is this crossing. Let me try to make it a little bit better. And you do it, and nothing happens. Nobody shows up, nobody's life is made any better, nobody responds. Then you can say, I got that one wrong, but the cost was very low. So now I'll go do this other thing that I think is the thing. And you learn and you product test, and then people respond to it, and they either affirm or deny your initial assumption. It's literally like the scientific process applied to governing. And that's why I started with the complex adaptive system. That's what it is. The only way we get over the problem that humans are fickle is that we work iteratively. I think we got time for one more. Who wants to be the... over here. Everybody's pointing over here. I'm sorry, you raised your hand, and then a chorus of people pointed over here. I'm sorry. I'll go with 2 more. 1 and then 2. Go ahead.
So Brookings has roughly 15 years of land left with the hills, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna argue with you right there off the bat, but go ahead.
So the challenge is a lot of people want to go outside the city and grow.
Yeah.
You know, the question is, where's the city going next? There's also opportunity to grow in town and make development. What is your recommendation or advice to Brookings, short-term and long-term?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the premise was we have 15 more years here in Brookings to grow. I'm going to attack that premise mercilessly now. And then the question also went, there's people who want to move outside the city and grow. Do we grow within the city? What should be the strategy? I think it's important to recognize that the idea of X amount of time left to grow is an anachronism of the post-World War II development pattern. It's the machine. Because literally the area that is your city is like smaller than the center of Rome, which has like 2 million people in it. So, you have an immense amount of space to grow and do it in a delightful way, but not the way you're doing it now. The way you're doing it now does have a limit. I'm suggesting you need to change that and flex that, and like we talked about before, thicken up your neighborhoods, and that would, in a sense, give you unlimited growth capacity within the framework you have now. And I think that's my answer to the second part of your question too. There's this, in cities of this size, and I count Brainerd as one of these where I live, where there's this same kind of tension. There's a tension between the desire to go out to the edge and build and the desire to build in the city center. And what I would suggest is that you stop making that a compromise. If you want to live on the outskirts of town and commute in, great. But we're not going to degrade our neighborhoods to make that easy. If you want to live on the outside of the city and drive through the middle of town to get to something on the other side of town, great. Like, we can accommodate that, but we're not going to sacrifice the ability of someone to walk across the street to go to the store to make that happen. So right now, if you look at the way we configure our cities, you're nodding, you're shaking your head. The way we configure our cities today is we say the public realm, the primacy of the public realm is about moving commuters as quickly as possible. People who don't live here, but who want to traverse through, get the primary, they're the most important people in our public realm today. And what needs to happen is that the person who lives in the neighborhood, the person who lives here, needs to become the most important person in the public realm. And the individual passing through, or the individual coming in, or the individual who doesn't live here is trying to get here, needs to become the secondary or tertiary of importance within that public realm. So, crossing streets on foot needs to be given precedent over driving through. Riding on a bike needs to be given precedence over high-speed automobile travel. Transit, a bus service, needs to be given priority over through traffic and the automobile. And that's the way that you make your own neighborhoods here far more valuable. And sure, if people want to go build on the edge, that's great. Go ahead and do it. We're not going to run sewer and water out there. We're not going to extend utilities out there because that's making us broke. We're going to focus on building what we have and making it really great. And if you do that, I think what you'll find is that there's a lot less demand for people to move out here, and there's going to be a huge amount of demand for people to move into your existing neighborhoods and live a real high quality life there. Last question then. Go for it.
We have a quick online question.
Oh, we have a quick online question? All right. I'm fine with that. Are you okay with that? Okay, quick online question.
This will be a quick one. It's in reference to the Taco John slide.
Well, it might be a quick question, but it might not be a quick answer.
No, it'll be a quick answer. In reference to the Taco John slide, Jessica asks, is the value shown the real estate market value or the tax assessment value?
In that case, it's the tax assessment value, but those are also reflective of, obviously, the real estate value. We've seen that particular example is the tax assessment value, but we have done those analysis using Zillow. We've done those analysis using realtors data. We've done the analysis using tax assessment data. What you're talking about are proportions. So you can think of the old blighted block as X. I'm sorry, you can think of the Taco John's as X. You should think of the old and blighted block as 1.78X, because it's 78% more valuable, regardless of where you ground your data. Go ahead. Seriously, wonderful. Thank you for being here. Yeah. They are, yes. Yeah.
Like, I guess the question is, how is the best way, because we're not going to tell them not to plan for this stuff.
Yes.
Because they can't afford what they're expecting.
It's breaking my heart. Your question is already.
So, how is the best way to help them do that most efficiently? I
Yeah.
personally work a lot in the water.
Right. So the wonderful woman, I'll just say this. I'm trying to get my youngest daughter to go into planning and engineering. She won't, but I would love her to. I love the fact that there are so many more. When I went to school, I'm not that old, I'm 48. I'd say we had 5 women in my graduating class. It is so different now. Yeah, I'm gonna give you the question. I'm just communicating. So the question was, you work in a lot of small towns. The small towns are gearing up now for the infrastructure bill. There's a lot of money flowing through from Washington, D.C., I'm guessing through the Department of Ag, through rural development, to fund sewer and water systems in small towns. How do we best guide them? How do we best help them? Because many of these places, and I'm going to say most of these places, are experiencing major distress and decline. Small towns are such a unique set of circumstances today, because to the extent that Brookings has been damaged by the post-war pattern of development, to the extent that Sioux Falls has been damaged by urban renewal and suburban expansion and highway development and all the things we experience there today, what we have done to small towns is almost criminal. We have taken places that were strong, resilient, had culture, had identity, and we've strip mined them intellectually. We've gone in under the guise of helping them become better off and provided them with more infrastructure and more stuff than they ever have a chance to possibly maintain. And we've done it all while waving this banner of you're rugged independent, you're you're all individuals, you're these great bastions of freedom and hope for tomorrow. And I find it tragically sad what has happened to small town America. There's no place that you're more dependent on your neighbors than small town America. There's no place where you have to be more innovative than small town America. There's no place where you have less margin of error than in small town America. And we've disrespected all of that with our policies. When I was very young, when I was right out of college, my first big project as an engineer was a rural development project in the city of Reamer, Minnesota. I went to Reamer and their sewer ponds were overflowing and it was threatening to destroy. They had ponds, they were threatening to overlap and break the dikes and actually have that sewage run straight into the river. It was a pending environmental catastrophe. The state pollution control agency was fining them $10,000 a year for noncompliance. This was a city whose entire city budget was $90,000. So this would be like the city of Minneapolis being fined, something like $500 million a year or something. It was just a huge amount of money. And I went out and did a study there to determine what was causing all of this excess flow, because it certainly wasn't growth. They hadn't grown at all. And what I discovered is that they had 300 feet of pipe that had cracked, was in the water table, was cracked and was leaking, and clean water, clean groundwater was flowing in, going out to their ponds and filling it up to the point where they were having all these problems. I went back to them and I said, and I'm 24 at the time, I said, I've been out here overnight. I pulled all your manhole covers. I figured it out. I solved the problem. We need to fix this 300 feet of pipe. Unfortunately, it's underneath the highway. This was in the mid-90s, so there wasn't boring technology the way there is today. We're going to have to trench this highway. The state was going to require us to case the pipe. It was going to be a $250,000 project. I said, well, that's great, Chuck. Thanks for solving this problem. We spent our last $15,000 in our sewer fund paying you to do this study. We don't have any money. Go out and find us a grant. I'm like, okay, I'm going to figure out how to do that now. So I go back to the office. I start digging in, talking to the senior engineers. How do I do this? They're like, it's not going to work. And I'm like, come on, help me. I finally got in touch with the grant agencies. They all said to me, this feels like maintenance. We don't fund maintenance. I'm like, well, what do you fund? Well, here's our project checklist. So I start going through their project checklist. They fund expansion to low-income communities. They fund economic development stuff that will create jobs and growth. They fund environmental remediation. They fund all this stuff that is basically like building new things. So I'm a young engineer. This is way before my Strong Towns days. I am a rather smart person. I sat down and I said, I can figure this out. And I came up with a $2.6 million project that doubled the size of their treatment facility, extended their sewer system to a part of town that had low income, the lowest, I mean, it was all low income, but this was low income people. It happened to go by a big field that I called a future industrial park, so we checked the economic development box. I upgraded their lift station, and I fixed this 300 feet of pipe because we were there with machines and could do it, and they didn't object. I filed that grant to all the agencies that had said, you don't qualify before. We were the #1 project in the state of Minnesota. We checked every box. We had the highest rating, and we got fully funded. The city had to pay $130,000. The USDA financed for them over 40 years at like sub-market interest rates. So, you know, they had to pay more than they could afford, but it was still a deal for them. The city had Chuck Marohn Day because I saved them, and that's how they looked at it. I got a $10,000 bonus from my company at the end of the year. They started calling me the Rainmaker because I took this city that we were never going to get a project out of, and all of a sudden I was making it rain, because a $2.6 million project is $500,000 in engineering fees. You know, it was a really good deal. And everybody thought I was a hero. The grant people thought I was a hero. The city people thought I was a hero. My bosses thought I was a hero. It took me a while to step back and look at that project and realize what I had done. I took a city that didn't have the money to fix 300 feet of pipe. And in order to solve that problem, I gave them 2 more miles of pipe. That's stupid. That is really, really dumb. So your question was like, what do we do different? And I feel like we have to get upstream of the funding to do that. We advocated for people to vote against the infrastructure bill because it was basically funding bad programs that did exactly this. But we have said, in the absence of any reform, which there's been zero reform in how these systems are funded, even though we see the catastrophic effects it has. So in zero reform, what we said is that cities have to make different choices. And the choices should be, if you can prioritize projects that are maintenance of underground infrastructure in old neighborhoods, it's hard to screw that up. And so if you can come up with projects in your cities that replace and repair existing old pipes in neighborhoods that have that old pre-Great Depression kind of bones and structure, if you can go into those neighborhoods and do a maintenance project to fix those pipes, you are buying that city time to get right instead of adding more burden to them. The opposite of that would be to build new stuff in new areas that sucks even more of the vitality out of the kind of fragile core that those cities have. That's a hard place to be, and I don't envy the conversations that you have to have with cities, because most of them are going to be enticed by the shiny object that they can get, not the kind of prudent thing they can do to slow the bleeding. But the slow the bleeding is actually what they need to do. I'm glad you asked me that question. I'm glad I took that. It's 11 after 8. I really appreciate like the enthusiasm and the interest. I'm super psyched that you're here. How old are you? 13? Where do you go to? You go to college here or what? No? What do you do? What's your name? Lucas? What grade are you in? Are you here because you were forced to be here because you wanted to be? Was this interesting though? Okay, cool, Lucas. Thank you. Do you have Snapchat? No. You got a good mom. I got Snapchat because my kids do, but my kids are in 9th grade and 11th grade. So that's the deal. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it.